24 hours ago, 16-year-old Emma Vance disappeared without a trace. Asterisk asterisk. The sheriff told everyone she had run away to Chicago with a boy. But one man in Pine Ridge knew that was a lie. Because the night Emma disappeared, John Miller found something the sheriff didn't want anyone to see. Fresh tire tracks buried beneath the snow, asterisk asterisk, and a trail of blood leading deep into the forest. John was 55 years old, a retired logger, a quiet man who wanted nothing to do with the town anymore. But there was one problem. John hadn't always been a logger. Asterisk asterisk. 20 years ago, he had been something else, something dangerous. And when he found Emma's silver locket beneath the snow, he realized this wasn't a teenage runaway case. Someone had taken her, and whoever did it had made one very big mistake. Asterisk asterisk. They had left John Miller a trail to follow. Today we talk about the story of the Silent Pines. Chapter 1, The Cold Footprints. The snow came early to Pine Ridge, Wisconsin, heavy enough by the last week of November to bend the thick pine boughs until they snapped like old bone. It was a town where trees vastly outnumbered people, and secrets outnumbered both. John Miller sat on the porch of his isolated cabin, the chill biting through his grease-stained flannel jacket. Age 55, with a rough, iron-gray beard and hands calloused from decades of hard labor. He looked like any other retired logger. But his fingers moved over the mechanics of a 1980s Charles Wilson double-action revolver with the fluid, unthinking precision of an ex-county deputy. He didn't clean the gun often. It had sat in the bottom drawer of his nightstand for nearly 20 years, wrapped in an oily rag. But what he'd found 48 hours ago changed things. Yesterday afternoon, Emma Vance, the 16-year-old daughter of the town's wealthiest timber tycoon, Richard Vance, had vanished. Sheriff Larry Vance, no relation to the tycoon, though heavily paid by him, had immediately ruled it a teenage runaway situation. He claimed Emma had hopped on a Greyhound bus to Chicago with some boy, but John knew Larry was lying. John had been walking the timberline 2 miles north of town late last night when he spotted fresh tire tracks cut deep into the mud beneath the fresh powder, followed by the dark, unmistakable spatter of blood on snow. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" The low, raspy voice broke the silence. John didn't look up. He knew the voice. It belonged to Myra, owner of the local roadside diner, and the only person in Pine Ridge who still bothered to check if John was alive. She set a steaming mug of black coffee on the wooden railing beside him. "Larry's got the whole town believing she ran off, but Richard Vance is losing his mind. He's got his own private security sweeping the South Ridge." John snapped the cylinder of the revolver shut. The sharp metallic clack echoed in the quiet air. "Larry's an idiot," John said, his voice flat, like gravel grinding under a boot. "If a girl gets lost in the deep woods out here in November, she doesn't last 4 hours. It's been 24. Chapter 2, The Silver Locket. By 3 in the afternoon, the Midwestern sun was already dropping behind the ridges, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. John hiked in deep, the snow crunching beneath his heavy leather boots. He carried an old canvas backpack containing a flashlight, a flare gun, basic trauma dressing, and a small box of extra .38 rounds. The forest here was ancient, choked with dense brush and pine needles that deadened sound. Cell service died 2 miles back at the county line. Took him 40 minutes to reach the spot near the old logging trail. The new snow had tried to hide the evidence, but John's eyes were trained to catch what others missed. He knelt by the base of a massive white oak. He brushed aside the top layer of powder with his gloved hand. Something glinted beneath the flashlight beam, a silver chain. Attached to it was a small, heart-shaped locket stamped with the initials EV. The metal was bent, torn violently from whoever had been wearing it. Right beside it, deeply embedded in the frozen mud beneath the snow, was a single boot footprint, size 11 or 12, deep tread, not a teenager's shoe. Crack. The sound of a heavy branch snapping shattered the quiet. John killed his flashlight instantly. He melted into the shadow of a trunk, his hands slipping inside his coat, to rest on the wooden grip of the revolver. Heavy, uneven footsteps approached through the brush. The person wasn't hiding their movement well, but they were cautious. The faint, sweet smell of cheap cherry tobacco drifted on the icy wind. There was only one man in the county who smoked those foul little cigars. Sam Barnes, the local junkyard operator and occasional poacher. Sam emerged into the small clearing, holding a 12-gauge shotgun at his hip, sweeping a weak flashlight beam across the snow. His breath came out in thick white clouds, and he was mumbling to himself. "Where is it? It's gotta be right here." John stepped out from behind the tree, moving without a sound. He pressed the cold muzzle of his revolver directly against the back of Sam's neck. "Drop the 12-gauge, Sam. Slowly." Chapter 3, Blood on the Timber. Sam froze, his whole body going rigid. He recognized that voice. 10 years ago, John Miller had put Sam's brother in federal prison for running meth through the county. John? Christ, man. Don't shoot. Sam lowered the shotgun carefully into the snow, raising his shaking hands. "What are you hunting out here in the dark, Sam?" "A lost girl." Sam turned slowly, his face slick with cold sweat despite the freezing temperature. "You don't understand, John. You need to walk away. Sheriff Larry told me to come out here and clear the trail. He said some idiot shot an illegal deer last night." John pulled the bent silver locket from his pocket and held it in front of Sam's eyes. "Does a deer wear a $50 silver chain?" Sam's jaw went slack. He swallowed hard, looking around the dark forest as if expecting someone to spring from the trees. "I swear to God, John, I didn't touch her." Sam whispered frantically. "Larry called me at midnight. He said there was a mess near the old sawmill road that needed cleaning up. When I pulled up in my truck, I saw a black SUV tearing out of the trail heading toward the highway. Did you catch the plate?" "No, lights were off. But it had a bumper sticker. A private country club out in Denver." John's mind raced. Only one person in Pine Ridge had ties to Denver. David Vance, Richard Vance's younger brother. A high-powered defense attorney who had arrived in town 3 days ago to settle a corporate dispute over the timber company. "Go home, Sam," John said quietly, lowering his weapon. "Keep your mouth shut. If Larry finds out I know about this, you'll be the first person he buries out here." Sam didn't wait to be told twice. He grabbed his shotgun and scrambled back through the brush toward the main road. John stood alone in the gathering dusk as the wind began to howl through the pine tops. A storm was rolling in, and temperature was plummeting. If Emma Vance was still alive somewhere out in these mountains, she had hours, maybe less. He looked south toward the sprawling, iron-gated estate of the Vance family, resting on the highest ridge in the county. It was time to pay an old acquaintance a visit. Chapter 4, The Vance Estate. The gated entrance to the Vance property looked more like a private fortress than a timber baron's home. Wrought iron pikes topped a 10-foot stone wall that stretched for half a mile along the highway. John avoided the main gate, where 2 hired security guards sat in an idling pickup truck, sipping coffee. He knew the perimeter. 30 years ago, before the walls were built, John had hunted deer on these hills with Richard Vance himself, back when they were young, broke, and ambitious. He cut through the drain culvert on the western edge of the estate, sliding through the snow-slick concrete pipe until he emerged near the estate's private horse stables. The main house sat 300 yards away, a towering 3-story structure of dark cedar and stone, ablaze with warm yellow light. John stayed low, moving from the cover of the stables to a line of decorative spruce trees. Through the massive bay windows of the ground floor study, he could see 2 men pacing. One was Richard Vance, slender, graying, wearing an expensive wool sweater, his face pale with grief and exhaustion. The other was his brother, David Vance. David looked slicker, younger, wearing a tailored suit despite the rural setting, holding a glass of bourbon in one hand and talking aggressively with his phone pressed to his ear. John reached the wrap-around wooden porch, avoiding the floorboards he knew squeaked. He stepped up to the side entrance, the kitchen door, and reached into his pocket for a thin piece of spring steel he'd carried since his deputy days. With a soft, metallic click, the lock gave way. John slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. The house smelled of expensive mahogany, wood smoke, and stale bourbon. From the hallway leading to the study, David Vance's voice came through sharp and angry. "I don't give a damn about the county board, Larry. You keep the state police out of Pine Ridge for another 12 hours. If federal investigators get involved, this whole land acquisition deal collapses, and we're all going to prison." John stepped into the doorway of the study, resting his hand on his revolver. "It's a little late for that, David," John said softly. Chapter 5, The Glass Room. Both men spun around. David dropped his glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor, spraying bourbon across his leather shoes. Richard froze, his eyes wide with shock. "Miller," Richard breathed out, stepping forward. "What the hell are you doing in my house? How did you get past security?" "Your security is sitting in a truck staying warm," John said, stepping fully into the light of the chandelier. "And your brother is lying to you. Get out before I call the sheriff," David snapped, stepping between John and Richard, his face flushing red. "You're trespassing, old man." John ignored David entirely, keeping his eyes locked on Richard. "I found Emma's locket 2 miles up the old sawmill road. Torn off. There was blood on the snow, Richard, and tire tracks from a vehicle with a Denver Club sticker on the bumper." Richard turned his head slowly to look at his brother. "David, your rental SUV has a Denver tag." "He's lying. He's a washed-up, crazy ex-cop who lives in the woods," David shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Richard, don't listen to him. He's trying to shake us down." "Where is she, David?" John asked, his voice chillingly calm as he drew his revolver and let it rest at his side. "The storm is dropping to 5 below zero tonight. If she's locked in an unheated structure, she's dying." Richard grabbed his brother by the lapels of his expensive suit, his voice shaking with sudden, terrifying rage. "David, what did you do? Where is my daughter?" David shoved Richard back onto the leather sofa, his composure completely shattering. He reached quickly toward the desk drawer, but John moved faster. In a single motion, John closed the distance, caught David by the wrist, and slammed his face down onto the mahogany desk. A small chrome pistol fell from David's fingers, clattering across the wood. "Last chance, counselor?" John growled, pressing his thumb hard behind David's ear until the lawyer let out a muffled scream. "Where is she?" The old icehouse," David choked out, tears mixing with the blood on his broken nose. "At the abandoned resort near North Lake. She heard me talking on the phone about the fraud. She was going to tell her father. I just needed to keep her quiet until the contract was signed." Richard buried his face in his hands, letting out a ragged sob. John pulled David up by his collar and shoved him hard toward Richard. "Tie him up, Richard. Use your belt. If he moves, shoot him with his own gun." John turned toward the door, pulling his wool cap down over his ears. "John," Richard called out, his voice broken. "The storm. It hit the North Pass 10 minutes ago. You'll never get a truck through the resort road." John didn't stop walking. "Then I'm taking the snowmobile." Chapter 6. The Frozen Lake. The wind on North Lake was a deafening howl that cut straight through heavy leather and wool. Visibility was down to less than 10 feet. The world had dissolved into a swirling wall of white and gray. John pushed the old Yamaha snowmobile to its limits, the engine screaming as it chewed through 2 feet of fresh drifts across the frozen lake bed. His face was completely numb, his eyelashes heavy with ice. The old North Lake Resort had been abandoned since the late 90s. A cluster of decaying log cabins surrounding a large, windowless stone icehouse built into the side of the granite ridge. He killed the engine 50 yards out, sliding off the machine into knee-deep powder. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the roar of the blizzard. He unholstered his weapon, holding his heavy flashlight in his left hand, and approached the heavy oak door of the icehouse. A thick steel padlock held the latch shut. John didn't waste time trying to pick it. He raised his revolver, pointed it directly at the shackle of the lock, and fired 2 quick shots. Bang, bang. Sparks flew into the dark. The shattered padlock fell into the snow. John kicked the heavy door open. "Emma!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the cavernous, pitch-black stone room. The air inside was even colder than the wind outside. A stale, damp freeze that smelled of old river mud and rot. His flashlight beam swept across empty wooden crates, rusted ice tongs, and piles of rotting sawdust. Then, in the far corner, he saw a heap of dark fabric beneath a fallen beam. John ran forward, dropping to his knees. It was Emma. She was curled into a tight ball, her hands tucked under her armpits, her face deathly pale, her lips a faint, terrifying shade of blue. Her skin was cold as marble. "Emma? Hey, open your eyes," John said softly, slipping off his thick leather gloves and pressing his warm palms against her icy cheeks. Her eyelids fluttered weakly. A tiny, shivering breath escaped her lips. "Mr. Miller?" "Yeah, kiddo. It's me," John said, quickly unzipping his heavy outer coat and wrapping it tightly around her small, trembling frame. He pulled an emergency thermal blanket from his pack, wrapping it over the coat. "Your dad's waiting. We're getting out of here." Chapter 7, The Last Stand. Before John could lift her into his arms, the sound of a heavy engine roared outside, blinding headlights cutting through the cracks in the stone wall of the icehouse. A loudspeaker crackled outside. "John, I know you're in there." It was Sheriff Larry Vance. John froze. He stepped toward the narrow slit of a window and peered out. Larry's official county cruiser was parked right behind the snowmobile, its red and blue lights flashing frantically through the swirling snow. Larry was standing behind his open door. A pump-action shotgun rested on the window frame. Next to him stood two deputy cruisers. "David called me from the house, John," Larry shouted over the wind. "You're facing kidnapping, breaking and entering, and assault on a federal officer's counsel. Put your weapon down and walk out with your hands up." Larry wasn't here to make an arrest. He was here to make sure no one left this lake alive. If Emma died of hypothermia and John was shot resisting arrest, David and Larry's land fraud scheme would remain buried forever. "Stay down, Emma. Don't move," John whispered, leaning against the cold stone wall. He checked his revolver. 4 rounds left. He took a deep breath, letting the icy air fill his lungs, calming his heart rate down to a steady, deliberate rhythm. He had spent 20 years trying to hide from the violentia of his past, trying to fade away into the quiet pines of Wisconsin. But as he looked back at the shivering teenager behind him, he realized some debts could only be settled in lead. John picked up a heavy wooden crate and threw it hard against the back door of the icehouse. Crash. "He's going out the back," Larry yelled outside. Through the front slit, John saw Larry and one of his deputies swing their attention toward the side of the building. John stepped out the front entrance, leveled his revolver, and fired twice. The first round shattered the spotlight on Larry's cruiser. The second caught the front deputy in the shoulder, knocking him backward into the snowbank. Larry screamed, ducking behind his car door as buckshot blasted wildly into the stone wall above John's head. John dropped flat into the snow, rolling behind the steel tracks of the snowmobile. He aimed low, beneath the frame of the police cruiser, where Larry's boots were visible in the flashing lights. Bang! The round hit Larry's ankle. The sheriff let out a high-pitched shriek, collapsing onto the frozen ice, his shotgun slipping from his hands. John scrambled up, closing the distance in 3 long strides. Before the remaining deputy could raise his sidearm, John kicked the weapon out of his hands and shoved him hard into the drifting snow, pressing the hot barrel of his revolver under Larry's chin. "It's over, Larry," John said, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the roaring wind. "Give me your truck keys." Larry, sobbing and clutching his shattered ankle in the snow, fumbled at his belt and threw the keys into the snow. Chapter 8. The sunrise over Pine Ridge. By 6 in the morning, the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world draped in a blinding, pristine blanket of fresh white. The sky to the east was stained a soft, bruised pink. At the Pine Ridge County Hospital, medical staff moved quickly through the warm corridors. Emma Vance was wrapped in heated blankets, and 4 running into her arm. Her father sitting by her bedside holding her hand tightly, tears quietly rolling down his face. In the hallway outside, 2 state police investigators were taking notes as John finished his statement. David Vance and Sheriff Larry were already in federal custody down in Madison, facing charges that would keep them behind bars for the rest of their lives. One of the state troopers, a young man with polished boots and a clean uniform, shut his notepad and looked at John with a mixture of awe and confusion. "You walked 2 miles through a Category 2 winter storm, took down 3 armed men, and hauled that girl out on a snowmobile with 4 bullets?" the trooper asked. "Who did you say you used to work for, Mr. Miller?" John pulled his old wool cap down over his forehead, his face showing no emotion. "Just a guy who likes his peace and quiet," John said softly. He turned and walked out through the automatic glass doors into the crisp, biting morning air. He walked down the main street of Pine Ridge toward Myra's Diner. The neon sign in the window was already glowing warm against the snow. Open. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee, fried bacon, and wood smoke filled the air. Myra looked up from behind the counter, set down her glass rag, and poured a heavy ceramic mug full of piping hot black coffee. She set it down at the corner booth without saying a word. John sat down, feeling the ache in his joints, the burn in his muscles, and the quiet, steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. He picked up the mug, took a slow sip, and looked out the window as the sun finally rose high over the quiet, snow-covered pines. Chapter 9: The Unfinished Business. The morning quiet in Myra's Diner didn't last. By noon, the news of Sheriff Larry Vance's arrest had spread through the county like a crown fire through dry timber. State police cruisers, clean, polished Ford Explorers with blue lights flashing, were parked bumper to bumper outside the municipal building downtown. John sat in the corner booth of the diner, nursing his 3rd cup of black coffee. The heat from the radiator hummed against his boots, but the chill in his chest hadn't quite left. The bell above the diner door jingled. A tall man in a dark gray woolen overcoat walked in. He wasn't a local. He had the sharp, watchful look of a man who spent his life in air-conditioned courtrooms and high-rise offices. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and looked around the diner with quiet disdain before his eyes locked onto John. "John Miller?" the man asked, walking over to the booth. John didn't look up from his cup. "Depending on who's asking. My name is Marcus Vance," the man said, pulling out the wooden chair opposite John and sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "I'm Richard and David's elder brother, the family's legal counsel from Chicago." Myra walked over, holding a pot of coffee. Her eyes narrowed. "Can I get you something, mister? Or are you just occupying space?" "Just water, thank you," Marcus said smoothly, setting his briefcase on the table. Once Myra walked away, Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I came to thank you for saving my niece, John. Truly. Richard is in no state to handle affairs, so I've taken control of the family estate." "Save your speeches, counselor," John said, his voice low and raspy. "David's going to prison. Larry's going to prison. What do you want?" Marcus opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and slid it across the table. "David was an idiot," Marcus said calmly. "He acted out of desperation because the timber acquisition was failing. But David wasn't working alone. There are high-ranking officials in the State Department of Natural Resources who signed off on those fraudulent land deeds. If David talks to federal prosecutors, names will be dropped that will ruin people far more powerful than a county sheriff." John looked down at the envelope. "What's in here, Marcus?" $200,000 in cashier's checks, Marcus said, his eyes cold and steady. "And a deed to a property in northern Michigan. Beautiful land, deep woods. Exactly the kind of place where a man like you can retire and never worry about local politics again." John smiled, a dry, humorless twitch of his mouth. "You're bribing me to keep my mouth shut about the state officials." "I'm offering you an exit, John," Marcus corrected gently. "You're an ex-deputy with a buried past. If you start testifying in federal court, people will dig into your history. They'll ask why a man with your specific tactical background vanished into the woods 20 years ago after that incident in Milwaukee. John's hand tightened around his coffee mug until his knuckles turned white. The state police already have my statement, John said softly. They have what you gave them last night, Marcus replied, leaning closer. A simple story about a local rescue. Keep it that way. Don't speak to the federal grand jury next week. Take the envelope, leave Pine Ridge, and let the dead lie where they fell. Chapter 10. The Shadow of Milwaukee. Marcus Vance left the diner 10 minutes later, leaving the manila envelope sitting on the Formica table like a loaded weapon. John picked it up, shoved it into his jacket pocket, and stood up. He left a $5 bill on the table for Myra, walked out into the freezing afternoon air, and headed toward his pickup truck. He drove north, away from the town, toward the high ridges where the timber cut ended and the deep, untouched national forest began. As he drove, his mind drifted back 23 years to Milwaukee. Before he was a quiet logger in Pine Ridge, John had been an undercover investigator for the state tactical unit. He had spent 3 years tearing down an organized crime syndicate operating out of the Great Lakes ports. He had done his job, but the syndicate had bought off 3 judges and a district attorney. When John realized the justice system was broken from the inside, he had taken matters into his own hands. 3 men died in an alley behind a warehouse on a rainy Tuesday night in 1999. The syndicate collapsed, but John had been forced to vanish, taking a dead man's identity and burying his real name deep in the dirt. David and Marcus Vance hadn't just stumbled into land fraud in Pine Ridge. They were part of the same old machine, the network of wealthy, protected men who believed the law was something you bought, sold, or buried in the snow. John pulled his truck off the logging road near an old stone quarry, half a mile from his cabin. He stepped out, the snow crunching beneath his boots, and walked to the edge of the pit. He pulled the manila envelope from his coat, opened it, and looked at the thick stack of cashier's checks. $200,000. Enough to buy silence. Enough to buy an easy life. He struck a wooden match against his thumbnail, held it to the corner of the paper, and watched it catch fire. He dropped the burning envelope into an empty iron drum near the quarry edge, watching the ash drift away on the icy wind. Chapter 11. The Sawmill Meeting. At 8 o'clock that evening, the snow began to fall again. Light, powdery flakes that danced in the headlights of John's truck as he pulled up to the abandoned Blackwood sawmill on the eastern border of the county. The sawmill had been shut down for a decade, its corrugated iron roof rusting, its massive circular blades hanging frozen over empty timber chutes. It was the place David Vance had used as a meeting ground for his backroom deals. John cut his engine, grabbed his double-action revolver from the seat beside him, and stepped out into the dark. Inside the sprawling, shadowy interior of the mill, a single amber light was burning near the supervisor's office on the upper catwalk. John walked silently across the sawdust-covered concrete floor, his boots making no sound. He mounted the metal stairs, his hand resting lightly on the iron railing. When he reached the top, he pushed open the door to the office. Marcus Vance was sitting behind a rusted steel desk, a silver laptop open before him, typing calmly. Standing beside him were 2 men in heavy winter coats. Neither of them carried themselves like local cops. They had the square shoulders, cold eyes, and subtle bulges under their left arms that marked them as private security operators from Chicago. "I hoped you wouldn't burn the money, John," Marcus said without looking up from his screen. "It makes things so terribly messy." "You brought guards to a small town, Marcus?" John said, standing in the doorway, his hands tucked loosely into his jacket pockets. "That tells me you're scared." Marcus closed the laptop with a soft click. "I'm not scared, Mr. Miller. I'm practical. The federal prosecutor in Madison just issued subpoenas for the Vance Timber Corporation's internal ledgers. If those ledgers are examined, my entire firm in Chicago goes down. I can't allow that." "So what's the plan?" John asked quietly. "Another unfortunate accident in the woods?" "Something like that," Marcus said, nodding to the 2 men beside him. "A tragic house fire at your cabin tonight. An old man, a wood stove, a little too much whiskey. The local authorities will be far too busy dealing with Larry Vance's trial to ask hard questions about a retired logger. The man on the left reached inside his coat, his hand closing around the grip of a silenced 9mm pistol. John didn't wait for him to draw. Chapter 12, Steel and Sawdust. In a single, fluid motion, John dropped his shoulder, pulled the Charles Wilson .38 from his coat, and fired through his own pocket. Bang! The heavy lead bullet hit the guard on the left squarely in the chest, the force knocking him back against the wooden filing cabinet. The second guard lunged forward, drawing his weapon, but John stepped inside his reach, grabbing the man's wrist and smashing the heavy steel frame of his revolver down onto the guard's collarbone with a sickening crack. The guard screamed, dropping his gun, but swung a heavy left hook that caught John across the jaw. John staggered back against the doorframe, blood warm in his mouth, but he rolled with the hit, brought his elbow up, and drove it hard into the guard's temple. The man went limp, crashing face down onto the floorboards. Marcus Vance scrambled backward, his face drained of all color. He reached toward the desk drawer, but John stepped across the room, grabbed Marcus by his silk necktie, and slammed him back against the window frame. The glass cracked in a spiderweb pattern behind Marcus's head. "You're not in a courtroom now, Marcus," John growled, his face inches from the lawyers. "There are no motions to file out here. No judges to buy. You can't kill me," Marcus stammered, his polished composure completely destroyed. "The federal authorities. They know I'm here. Then they'll know where to find your laptop," John said cold-bloodedly. John reached down, snapped the silver laptop shut, and pulled the encrypted flash drive out from the side port. He shoved the flash drive into his pocket. He let go of Marcus's tie, letting the lawyer slump onto the floor, gasping for air. John looked down at him with dark, tired eyes. "You have 1 hour to get in your car and drive south. If you're still in Wisconsin when the sun comes up, I won't use a gun next time." Chapter 13, The Silent Pine Ridge. By 3 in the morning, John was standing in the parking lot of the federal building in Madison, 90 miles south of Pine Ridge. The sky was clear, cold, and brilliant with stars. He walked up the broad granite steps to the main entrance, where 2 uniformed federal marshals stood guard behind the bulletproof glass. John pulled the silver flash drive from his pocket, along with a handwritten list of names: the state officials, the land developers, and the corrupt judges who had allowed the Vance family to operate with impunity for a decade. He slipped the drive and the note into an official Dropbox near the entrance, turned around, and walked back to his truck. He didn't leave a name. He didn't ask for credit. When he drove back into Pine Ridge 4 hours later, the first light of dawn was painting the snow-capped tops of the pines in shades of gold and soft violet. The town was completely quiet. The police cruisers were gone. The highway was clear. John pulled his truck up to his cabin, killed the engine, and stepped out into the crisp, clean morning air. He walked onto the wooden porch, sat down in his old rocking chair, and pulled his coat tight against the cold. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the Charles Wilson revolver, and looked at it for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he took out the remaining cartridges, dropped them into his palm, and tossed the empty gun onto the wooden table beside his chair. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, easy breath of the pine-scented air. For the first time in 20 years, the silence in the woods didn't feel like a hiding place. It just felt like home. Chapter 14, The Echoes in the Valley. The federal indictment landed on a Tuesday morning with the force of a falling oak. By 9 o'clock, 3 separate state senators, 2 regional judges, and the head of the Department of Natural Resources had been taken into custody by federal marshals in Madison. The story dominated the headlines from Chicago to Minneapolis. The media called it the Northern Pine Conspiracy, a multi-million-dollar land grab scheme that had quietly operated in the shadows of the Midwest for over a decade. In Pine Ridge, the atmosphere was surreal. The town had lost its sheriff, its wealthiest family was ruined, and its quiet streets were briefly filled with news vans and satellite trucks. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, the circus moved on. The reporters ran out of new footage of snow-covered pines, the satellite trucks packed up, and the small town was left to clean up its own wreckage. John Miller didn't go into town much during those weeks. He stayed on his ridge, hauling firewood, repairing the damaged roof of his woodshed, and letting the quiet rhythm of winter settle back into his bones. On a sharp, sunlit afternoon in mid-December, the sound of a small car engine echoed up the winding dirt road toward his cabin. John stopped chopping wood, resting his hands on the top of his splitting maul, watching as a blue Subaru wagon pulled into his clearing. The driver's door opened, and Richard Vance stepped out. He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago. The sharp, ruthless edge of the timber tycoon was gone, replaced by the tired slump of a father who had stared into an abyss. He was wearing a plain woolen coat, no longer accompanied by security guards or expensive cars. Richard walked slowly across the snow, stopping a few feet from where John stood. "John," Richard said, his voice quiet against the vast silence of the woods. "Richard," John replied neutrally. "Emma wanted me to bring you this," Richard said, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small, wrapped wooden box. "She made it in her art class. She still nightmare wakes sometimes, but the doctors say she's going to be okay." John set the maul aside, wiped his gloved hand on his jeans, and took the box. Inside was a hand-carved pine locket, painted silver, with a simple note that read, "Thank you for coming into the dark." John carefully closed the lid and slid the box into his pocket. "How are you holding up, Richard?" Richard let out a long, foggy sigh, looking around at the towering trees. "The company is going into receivership. Most of the land is being turned over to the state park system. I'm selling the estate on the ridge, moving Emma down to Indiana, near her aunt." "That's probably for the best," John said. Richard looked directly into John's eyes, not with anger, but with a deep, lingering curiosity. "The federal prosecutors. They said someone handed them 20 years of internal ledgers. Documents David thought were encrypted on a private server in Chicago. They asked me if I knew who brought it to them." John said nothing. The wind rustled the high pine canopy above them. Richard nodded slowly, asking no further questions. "I spent 30 years building an empire out here, John. I thought I owned this county. But when the storm came, I couldn't even protect my own daughter. You never owned anything, yet you saved her." "I owned my own time, Richard," John said softly. "That's usually enough." Richard held out his hand. John took it, their calloused hands gripping firmly in the cold air. "Goodbye, John. Take care of her, Richard." Chapter 15. A Quiet Hearth. That evening, the temperature dropped to 0. The sky was a vast dome of indigo, dusted with millions of brilliant, sharp stars. Inside the cabin, the cast iron wood stove glowed a warm, deep orange, casting soft shadows across the log walls. The smell of burning birch and fresh coffee filled the room. The front door opened with a soft creak, letting in a gust of icy air before Myra stepped inside, carrying a heavy canvas bag. "You really need to fix that latch, John," she said, setting the bag on his wooden table. "A strong wind could blow this door right off its hinges." "I'll get to it in the spring," John said, smiling faintly as he poured a second mug of coffee. Myra took off her heavy coat, draped it over the back of a chair, and pulled 2 fresh cherry pies from her bag. "The diner was empty tonight. Thought I'd bring these up before they went cold." "You don't need to keep checking on me, Myra," John said, handing her a mug. "Someone has to," she replied, taking a sip and looking over at the corner table. The Charles Wilson revolver was no longer sitting out. It was back in the bottom drawer of the nightstand, unloaded, wrapped in its oily cloth. Beside it lay the small wooden locket Emma had carved. Myra walked over to the window, looking out into the vast, dark expanse of the forest. The pines stood tall, silent, and motionless under the starlight, guarding the valley as they had for 100 years. "Is it really over?" she asked softly. John walked up beside her, holding his warm mug in both hands, feeling the steady heat of the cabin at his back and the quiet peace in his heart. "It's over, Myra," John said. Outside, a soft snow began to fall again, dusting the quiet trails, covering the old tire tracks, and burying the last remnants of the storm in a deep, clean white. Chapter 16. The Changing of the Season. Winter in northern Wisconsin does not end with a sudden thaw. It retreats slowly, inch by painful inch, as March gives way to April. The ice on North Lake began to crack with heavy, booming sounds that echoed across the valley like distant artillery, and the thick banks of snow along the logging roads melted into rushing streams of mud and icy water. With the spring came a quiet transformation in Pine Ridge. The state government officially annexed 12,000 acres of the former Vance timberland, designating it as the Pine Ridge Wilderness Preserve. The tall iron gates of the Vance estate were dismantled, and the stone walls were left to be reclaimed by wild moss and ivy. For the first time in 50 years, the woods belonged to no corporation, no tycoon, and no shadow network. In town, a new sheriff was appointed, a former state trooper named Sarah Miller, no relation to John. She was a quiet, sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s who made it clear from her first day on the job that things in Pine Ridge would be run strictly by the book. There would be no backroom deals, no covered-up accidents, and no special favors for wealthy weekenders. One bright April afternoon, Sheriff Sarah drove her utility vehicle up the muddy trail toward John's cabin. John was on his porch, replacing a rotted wooden deck board with a newly planed piece of pine. He looked up as the black and gold cruiser pulled to a stop in his clearing. Sarah stepped out, wearing her crisp beige uniform and a dark green jacket. She leaned against the hood of her vehicle, looking around at the quiet clearing before turning her gaze to John. "Mr. Miller," she said, offering a respectful nod. "Sheriff," John replied, setting his hammer down on the wooden bench. "Everything all right in town?" "Town's quiet," Sarah said, pulling an official folder from her jacket. "I'm just wrapping up the final audit of the department's old evidence room. Found a few things left behind by Larry Vance before he was transferred to the federal penitentiary in Minnesota." She walked up the porch steps and handed John a small, yellowed manila folder. John opened it. Inside was a copy of his original arrest record from Milwaukee, dated 1999, along with a handwritten note from Larry Vance attempting to cross-reference John's fingerprints with an old federal unsolved file. "Larry was keeping tabs on you," Sarah said quietly. "He was waiting for the right moment to use your past against you if you ever got in his way." John looked at the paper for a long moment, feeling the ghosts of his old life flickering in the sunlight. "And what are you going to do with it, Sheriff?" Sarah took the folder back from his hands, pulled a heavy steel Zippo lighter from her pocket, and struck the wheel. She held the flame to the corner of the document, watching the yellowed paper curl into black ash right there on the wooden steps. She dropped the burning remnants into an empty coffee tin. "Larry's files were notoriously incomplete and unverified," Sarah said smoothly, her eyes meeting John's with complete clarity. "As far as the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department is concerned, John Miller is just an honorable, retired citizen who likes his privacy. Have a good afternoon, Mr. Miller." She turned, walked back to her cruiser, and drove down the muddy road, leaving behind only the soft hum of her engine and the scent of sweet birch smoke. Chapter 17. The Road Ahead. By May, the forest had fully awakened. Wild ferns uncurled along the creek beds, and the canopy blossomed into a vibrant, brilliant green. John stood at the edge of the quarry where he had burned Marcus Vance's bribe money 5 months ago. The iron drum was gone, swallowed by fresh grass and wild blackberry bushes. He felt no lingering weight, no waiting dread. The long winter had finally passed, taking with it the dark debts of the past. That evening, John walked down into town, arriving at Myra's diner just as the sun set behind the ridge. The neon sign buzzed softly in the twilight. Inside, a few local loggers and park rangers sat at the counter, chatting quietly over hot meals. Myra smiled as John took his usual seat in the corner booth. She brought over a fresh pot of coffee and 2 thick slices of warm berry pie. "You look different today, John," Myra said, setting the plate down. "How's that?" John asked, taking a sip of the hot coffee. "You look like a man who isn't waiting for the other shoe to drop," she said warmly, sitting down across from him. John looked out the window at the quiet main street of Pine Ridge. Children were riding their bicycles near the square. The forest stood tall and calm against the dusk sky, and the cool evening breeze carried the fresh, clean scent of blooming pine. "I think the shoe already dropped, Myra," John said with a faint, genuine smile. "And it missed." He reached across the table, picked up his fork, and enjoyed his dinner in the peaceful silence of the town he had saved. A man with no past to run from, no debts left to pay, and a long, quiet road stretching out beneath the clear summer stars.